So now we've got a little over half an hour to try and tease out what we make of this. I don't think this will come as a surprise to anyone in the sense that all of us in this room, I think, have shared the concerns that have been highlighted by ASPO over a number of years. But this is, Reiner, your presentation, I think, is brought it out more clearly in terms of the physics and the economics of why that 5% is just so wrong. And Bob, your presentation too has brought that through very clearly with the shadow of the past casting its long shadow on us. Gentlemen on my right here, both involved, Thomas and Olivier, in financial analysis, oil markets and gold and so forth, which has just been mentioned. A couple of quick reactions from your side to what you've just heard. What are the key take-homes from your side and what you're already seeing happening in your respective areas that confirms or perhaps even challenges what you've just heard?
I thank you both gentlemen for your speech. I want to refer to Professor Hirsch's speech. It was very important to mention that the United States went out of the gold standard on August 71. And I think a very important point is that Nixon and his people went to Saudi Arabia then, after this, because the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the kings were only representing 15% of the people, but had 85 to 90% of the oil revenues. So this is a dangerous situation for a country, and the Americans were kind of promising them to help them out from danger from outside, but also from inside. And for doing that, the oil prices were nominated in US dollars then, really worldwide, by Saudi Arabia and by OPEC. And then the story was going on. But some points were pretty new for me, because I didn't study the 73, 74 too much. And I was very surprised also by the difference between the costs of energy and the output of energy. Despite the fact that I'm watching oil markets daily, I did not know that what the professor said before here. So thank you for your speeches.
Great, thanks. And you had a slide or two. Do you want to use those, or have you more or less covered that already? I know that you'd had some slides in relation to gold price and...
I got some slides here, and I would like
Perhaps if you just show those now.
Yes, but I don't know how to change the slides. Do you?
Well, perhaps while that's being done...
Okay. In my opinion, I got 5 minutes by the organization, so I have to be quick. In my opinion, we have a couple of challenges right now. Peak oil, of course, but there are smarter people than I am who are talking about that. But there is also peak government. We have enormous strong governments right now, and the result of that is that we have every year a higher number of people who are addicted to the government and its help. And this help can only be managed by currency management. So we have a big currency management at the moment. Now I would like to change. Oh, danke für mich, Christa. So, to answer the peak oil, most of the people will probably know, I'm getting quick through that, Simon's axiom, commodity shortages lead to the development of new resources. Rising prices lead to intensified search for replacements. So I don't see that peak oil situation that tough like the people talked before. And the replacements lead to stable or even falling prices and stable supply period. So as a result, we had this statistical forecast for our reserves at 30 years, but this was already 30 years ago. And this is stable. We still have 30 years, as far as I know. Yeah, and on the short term, I was involved in OPEC conferences, in almost any OPEC conference between 2004 and now, and I was an analyst for CNBC, Bloomberg, and the spare capacity was a big thing there, because we had smallest spare capacities since 1973, and this was in year 2004 and 5. And everybody will remember that even two jeeps with Nigerian soldiers were bombing up a pipeline, and the oil prices were rising $4. This was due to these lower spare capacities. But as I said, Simon's axiom, I was pretty much surprised that now the spare capacities are on 6 million again. Yeah. So, and they were below 1 million in year 2005. So this axiom tells me that also in the short term and with higher prices, we could manage to feel more safe. And talking about oil, watching oil, you have always to take care on the spare capacities. And there is a good quote from the legendary oil minister Yamani. He said, "The Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. The oil age will not end because we have run out of oil. It will end because people invent alternatives." And I'm pretty much positive about that. I think those alternatives are developed, and with higher prices, like Canadian oil, and with higher prices, we work it out. Maybe I'm a little bit over-optimistic. What I'm not optimistic of is our currency system. Of course, I'm from the Gold Standard Institute, and we are in peak money management. And you have to imagine, oil and gas are the most important non-arbitrarily increasable commodities. Yeah? We have a limited production scene, we have limited oil and gas in the earth, but oil and gas is measured and settled using the almost most freely producible currency, the US dollar. So we have a limited commodity and a freely yardstick to measure the worth of the commodity. And I think this is most of the historical moves which we had to go over in the first decade of this century. It's not an oil problem, not at all. It was not a supply-demand problem, only for a short time, I would say between 2004 and 2006. It's a matter of the currency system and how United States is linked into the oil market. Because whenever the oil market rises, imagine 10 years ago we had the price of $20. Now we have a price of, today we are on 87, but we had a price of 100 for a couple of months. It's 5 times more. So people or the nations of the world are buying 5 times more US dollars to be able to buy the same amount of oil like they did 10 years ago. And these US dollars, who were constantly produced by a guy named Alan Greenspan, now it's flattening out, but those US dollars were produced and were, of course, having inflation pressure on the country, and America was exporting with high oil prices the dollars. This is my very simplified standpoint on this. Also, monetary measurements. This is a chart made by Stöffele from Erste Bank. You can see the time of QE1, which was exactly on 18th March of 2009. And as you see on the chart, after the measurements of QE1, where they produced money, like in a factory, I could say, the prices were going up by 68%. QE2 had a little less impact. QE2 was on 4th and 5th, I think 4th or 5th November 2010. And you can see we made in the oil price 27% plus. And I'm quite sure, but this is not a prediction, it's, how did you say, suggestion, that due to the elections in November, the government of the United States is going to make a QE3, so the stock markets will go up, and that's kind of a presidential bonus. And I don't know what the oil prices are going to happen, but as we have the experience of QE1 and QE2, it might be lead to higher oil prices. And the next picture is quite interesting. This is oil price in US dollar versus in gold, beginning with this decade. I had to pay $23 or so on January 2000 for a barrel of oil, or I had to pay 3-point-something grams in gold. Now we have to pay $87. We had to pay, for a short time, we had to pay $140, but that doesn't really count. And in gold, I only have to pay 86 grams now. So, and you see the curve. It is much more stable. The most important good, oil, measured in gold is much more stable than measured in the US dollar. And the lack of stability is, in my opinion, the cause of all of those problems right now. Why I'm relying on gold standard or on gold and measure, not exchange, but measure gold in oil. I want to explain this, and this is probably my most important picture to you. And you probably don't know that fact. This is the stock-to-flow ratio. We are not relying in the gold standard because gold is shiny, or because gold is rare, or because it's chemical things. We are relying on it because of its stock-to-flow ratio. And I explained to you, we have 99% of all of the produced gold is still there, and we know where it is. So gold does not disappear. But it gets harder to find. And the strange thing is, but we are getting always more intelligent. And the technical development guarantees us that we always find 1/70th a year of the gold what we have produced. This is the stock-to-flow ratio from 170,000 tons, numbers of 2011, to 2,400 to 2,500 tons, what we produced in the same year. It's about 70-71 to 1. And this relationship, no other commodity has this. This is the most stable relationship of all. So let's pretend that Putin found a gold mine and the world production will double. It does not harm the gold price really, because 1/70th, more gold on the market, it will harm it a little bit, the gold prices will go down. Or let's say we have a super recession and we produce non-gold or nothing, or less gold, half of the gold, the gold prices won't rise too much. So this is the stability. This is why it's the best yardstick to a certain value of other commodities and goods, in my opinion.
We need to finish.
I'm finishing soon. New monetary policy, we need that definitely. Stable energy prices, because stable energy prices, the people are now not planning this aggressively or progressively because they have no confidence in the energy prices. They are a stable energy, a stable monetary system would encourage the development of new projects and products, and it would lead to innovation and complete economic system change. And that was about it.
Great, thanks very much. Olivier, firstly, let me thank you for filling in at short notice. This is very kind of you. But you've worked, you're working as an oil gas analyst. What's your take on what you've just heard? The peak oil, peak plateau approach, or the profound economic consequences, or peak optimism?
Okay. I will first react to this last presentation, and will conclude on the presentation of our two distinguished speakers. Could we come back to the second slide, if it's possible? In fact, I'm going to react on 2 points. There is one point on which I fully subscribe, and others to which I do not fully subscribe. The first one is that it makes complete sense, I think, to make a comparison, or to recall that there is a common point between what happened in the 70s and what is now happening for a few years, is that there is a general situation of monetary disorder. And this by itself is amplifying the consequences of what the oil situation is able to create by itself. In other words, supply constraints, physical constraints on oil, strictly speaking, is by itself a reason, it's a factor which is able to derail the world economy by itself. But this is amplified by the fact that there is, like in the 70s, a situation of monetary disorder based on structural imbalances in the US, in Europe, in China, with undervaluation of the Chinese currency, and this is deeply affecting, let's say, the situation of the world economy and also commodities markets. So on this point, I fully subscribe that this is a factor for concern. The point on which I do not subscribe at all is that there will be that commodity shortages will lead to the development of new resources and will lead to intensified search for replacement. This is based on let's say, the approach which has been developed over the last 30 years by most analysts and most economists, that there is full substitution of different energy sources. And this goes back to what Mr. Hirsch very rightly outlined, that there is a hierarchy of the problems to come, and that there is no full substitution between the different energy sources. The main constraint is on liquid fuels. And it's a dream to think that it will be easy, fast, and in some cases even physically possible to substitute other forms of energy, mostly electricity, to those liquid fuels. So here, I think it's this is, I think, an error of diagnosis to believe that there will be easy replacements, that there will be easy alternatives, if at all, to the liquid fuels crisis.
Never said easy.
Okay, okay. Okay, I do not say easy, but even if it's not easy, there are many more constraints to take into account before assuming that, let's say, the classic and cyclical behavior of commodity markets is by itself providing an answer by developing new reserves. The situation of the oil market over the last 10 years is every day demonstrating the contrary.
Can I just ask you?
And then I go back to what has been presented by our two distinguished speakers. Their approach, I think, is not only perfectly right, but it's the only one which makes sense. Until recently, this approach of showing the true value of energy in the production function in the economic system has been underestimated, vastly underestimated. But the situation is not hopeless, and I will refer to two papers which have been published in the first one last year, the second one very recently in the last few weeks, published by the IMF, published by a German economist, Michael Kümmel, working at the IMF. And it's very interesting to see that even, or let's say that in an international body like the IMF, you would not expect to see the development of a diagnosis saying the role of energy is totally underestimated, and if we apply the right analysis and the right methodology and the right modeling to the issue, we can see that the potential effect on GDP is most probably much more dramatic than what is usually developed and advertised by other organizations. So I fully subscribe to what has been developed, and unfortunately the conclusion is that we can consider, or my view is that the current situation on the lack of growth, more specifically for European countries, Western European countries, is already the beginning of this general constraint on energy supply.
Great, thanks. Well, perhaps if we can try and focus on a couple of, thank you, a couple of sectoral, yeah. Yeah, perhaps responses there and concentrate on some sectors to the extent that we can, because it seems to me from what has been said overall, this has clear implications, particularly in terms of liquid fuels for the aviation industry, for the agriculture industry and for manufacturing industry, where the substitutes aren't going to be particularly ready. But Reiner, would you like to respond?
Well, is it working?
Yes. Yeah.
Just to remark, Michael Kümmel has been in contact with me for 3 or 4 years.
No coincidence.
But this is the same IMF that this week actually announced that oil prices over 100 for a sustained period has not had a perceivable impact on economic growth and in particular on recession.
Well, this shows one thing: there are internal tension inside the IMF.
Yeah.
I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that were made here. One of the things that we did, first of all, I was in the oil industry for 15 years. I was in the solar industry. I was involved in fusion. I was involved in nuclear power. I was involved in a number of different technologies. But I have a good understanding of the oil industry because I was involved in it. Oil is a finite resource. There is only so much of it there, and the resource is different than reserves, and I'm sure you probably know this. Reserves are what you calculate that you can draw out, okay? Through a long process, we determined that world oil prices, as many people have, world oil production will go into decline. When it's in decline, we're going to do something about it. We're not about to roll over, for instance. You talked about substitutes. One of the things that we did for the Department of Energy in the United States, first published in 2005, was to take a look at the limiting case. A physicist understands limiting cases. The limiting case of how fast we could make up for or mitigate the problem associated with this loss of liquid fuels in the world economy. And we picked 5 things that could have a big impact. One is energy efficiency, which is always good under any conditions. Canadian oil sands, heavy oil from Venezuela, enhanced oil recovery that could be practiced on a much higher level. Coal to liquids, we've heard that that's an established technology. Sasol in particular in South Africa did a marvelous job of quickly building a second plant in the late 1970s. And the other is gas to liquids. These are established technologies. And we looked at what's the best that could be done with a worldwide crash program. We defined that as the limiting case of what could be done. And the problem is that to build a coal to liquids plant, for instance, look at the best that was ever done. That was done by Sasol. They built a duplicate plant of over 100,000 barrels a day in South Africa when they were cut off from Iranian oil. They did that in 3 years. These are big operations. They are very big operations, and to get a significant amount of oil, you have to build big things. You have to do things on a large scale. Our conclusion was that if you wait till the problem hits and then clear out all barriers and assume the people are there and the money is there and everything is there, again, limiting case, that those things won't happen, but limiting case, it would take much more than 10 years to catch up to a problem that is running away from you. And so comes the question of what do you do? It seems to me we're going to continue to care about the environment without question. We're going to continue to care about global climate change, but we're going to care most about people who are in pain. And people will be in pain, in our view, because of the things I described here and other analyses. And so the best you can do is to run to catch up to something that's running away from you.
Great. Let's take a few comments or questions from the audience at this point. Front row here. Do we have some microphones? Microphone on its way. So if you could please just give your name, affiliation, and state your question or comment as shortly as possible.
My name is Hugh Kelly. Thank you very much for your presentations. This question is for any of you who would like to answer it, maybe for the expert in gold. Since our regime of fiat currency that began in 1971 when Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard. It's been very easy for us to increase the money supply. It's no problem. And increasing the money supply works fine if the economy is growing too. You don't have inflation if the economy and maybe especially energy stocks are increasing with the money supply. Do you believe that I believe that we're in a monetary crisis now because we're using monetary policy to try to stimulate the economy, but the energy supplies are not increasing, so therefore we're getting inflation. Do you think that the reason that the fiat currency system worked well is because it happened to be at a time when energy stocks were increasing, and do you think we're now at a crisis because is basically fiat currency no longer working because energy supplies are slowing down? Thanks.
Great, thanks. Who'd like to have a go at that? Thomas, do you want to come in?
Sure. Let's talk about monetary policy. When in the 50s in the United States, I only can have numbers for United States. In the 50s, every produced additional US dollar was causing an economic growth of 70 cents. And Keynesianistic, I say it now in short. And now it's on 7 cents because it depends on the age where the economy is. And we are now in an elder economy. And so the additional dollar unit does not produce what it produced before, but they still are doing it. But they just need more and more dollars. And you can see this in the latest history as well. All these Konjunkturprogramme, programs to push the economy, every 18 months you have 5 times higher money putting in, at stake. This is because it doesn't work probably when you are mature in helping the economy. So in the 50s it was okay, now it's not okay. So that's my form of answer.
Great, thanks. Olivier, do you want to add to that? Then we have a question at the back there, and I've got one, you here, sir, and you there. Right at the back. Please.
One element of answer on this point?
Yes.
Well, I will summarize very abruptly. I think many OECD countries are currently printing money to buy the oil they cannot afford.
Okay. Thanks very much. Sorry?
Maybe we should use energy as the basis for all currencies. Of course, this would be good in an ideal world, where the energy resources, especially the oil resources, are right now. That's bad for the world. But from a production theoretical point of view, we should base the currency on the energy reserves. And the fact that the dollar is the currency in which oil has to be bought is the reason why everybody still has confidence in US economy and accepts dollars, despite the fact that the gross debt of the United States is now nearly 100% of gross domestic product. Is much worse than that of Spain, which is in trouble. But the US, as you say, can print money to buy oil. And if we would reverse the thing, base the money, the currency, on the energy, I think things would become more stable.
Great, thanks.
Jeremy Leggett from Solar Century and the UK Industry Task Force on peak oil. I have a question for Bob, but I guess the rest of the panel as well, and it involves a reaction to 2 quick anecdotes that I think may pertain to your fascinating presentation. Our task force, when we've been lobbying government, we've had very little traction at all, and at one point in the process, a very senior official in the Prime Minister's office said to me, the problem you face is that for politicians, there is nothing in this issue. If you raise it in opposition, you will be castigated for scaremongering. if you face it in office, you're dead anyway, because you won't be able to deal with it, and the opposition lie machine will pin the blame on you in office. But with industry, I mean, the experience of our own task force is, I think, intriguing here, because the big companies, and we're talking about FTSE 100 companies that came into the task force, not all of them were convinced that imminent peak oil was a problem. But what they were convinced of was that it was a high consequence issue, and that it merited, study of the risk factors. And of course, once we'd done that over the course of a year and 18 months, all the companies came out of the process, not just with consensus, but agreement. And I'm sure you know this, but our estimate is that the point of dissent is exactly where you put it. We say by 2015 at the latest. And that suggests to me that maybe what we should do is set the politicians to one side and see what we can do, all of us who worry about this problem, in persuading the industrial world.
Thanks very much.
Okay. Excuse me. First of all, you all did a fine study, and I thought it was quite reasonable, factual, non-hysterical, and it's one of the milestone studies that have been done in this field recently. Your point about the politicians. Politicians tend to most easily react when there is a problem that's right there and it's obvious that they have to deal with it, as opposed to being anticipatory. The peak oil, if I can call it that, the peak oil problem is a bad news story. People don't like to talk about bad news. They'd rather worry about what's going on today, worrying about today's problems, tomorrow's problems, but something that is as catastrophic as peak oil can be is a very, very bad news story. It's very hard to communicate with politicians because of their orientation and because of the character of this problem. Consider the climate change concern that many people have. Climate change is something that conceivably you can do something about. It's a good news story because it's a purity story. We can do better if we set our minds to it. And it has been managed politically and from a public standpoint much better than the peak oil story. I think we have an inherent problem. We've tried, a number of us have tried, many people in this room have tried in many different ways to explain to politicians that you need to get ahead of this problem and take it seriously. We've not succeeded in that. I'm not sure what can be done to change that. Any ideas that people have would be welcomed here and in many places.
Reiner.
Let me comment on politicians. In 1998, just before the German elections, the Green Party suggested that one should raise energy taxes so that 1 liter of gasoline would cost now €2.50. That was 5 marks then. There was an uproar in the German public. Everybody was pounding them. Of course, it was silly to say that right before the elections. But the leader of the German Christian Democratic Party in the Bundestag, who is now finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, he said, the Greens are right. Then I wrote him a letter, that's great. And he responded, I'm quite confident that in the long run, we will achieve a transition from taxing labor to taxing energy and resources. I reminded him of that recently, but I didn't get any reply. Because, and it's not because the politicians don't have the insight, but because the tabloids, the press, and the common people will just beat them, don't re-elect them. We are addicted to cheap energy. It's us, not the politicians. They know better. very often they know very well about the problems. But once I have been talked, when I talked about the limits to growth 23 years ago to the technology experts of the Social Democratic Party, I was told that maybe all okay what you say, but first travel around the country and teach everybody about the problem and that we should do about that something. We are elected for 4 years, and if we would react to that, we will be ousted right away. And he made more comments. He said, it's maybe all okay, but first get the public to accept the fact. Politicians are smarter very often than we are. I mean that the general electorate is.
Thank you. I need to take some.
I just wanted to make one.
Okay, quick. Well, then we have 2 last comments, then we're going to break.
A point that we discussed, thought about long and hard about, is the following. For people in significant positions to say that there's a peak oil problem, say the President of the United States, the Chancellor, Prime Minister, to stand up, or a major oil company like Exxon, to stand up and say that there is a problem coming, and this is the character of the problem, that in itself would cause chaos in the public. In other words, people would begin to say, my God, this thing that maybe I hadn't heard about or that I heard a little bit about is serious. I better go do something quickly. Stock markets would conceivably drop significantly. There would be a lot of confusion and so forth. So it's a very delicate problem to stand up and publicly say and be heard that this problem is coming and is real.
That's true. 2 quick questions, comments, please.
Thank you very much. Pedro Prieto from ASPO in Spain. That's for Mr. Kümmel. I do agree that we should shift the burden of taxes rather from labor to more on capital and energy. But the figures you have given are very interesting. But I wonder whether I would like to know your opinion on whether the shifting taxes from labor to capital or to energy will not provoke, should not be done on global terms rather than on national terms. Because if we have if we impose taxes on energy and capital in one nation or in one region, and we do not do in the other one, the capital will flow immediately because it's flowing much easier than the unconventional oil in the kerosene. So,
you're perfectly right. The OECD did a study 10 years ago on this thing, and the instrument to avoid the problem you are indicated perfectly well is border tax adjustments. It should, of course, it would be best to do it globally, but that won't happen. I think it will be also difficult to do it nationally. But my big hope was on the European Union. If we would do the following, in all of Europe, we introduce a shift of the burden of taxes and levies from labor to energy. Then, it's only energy, then we should impose border tax adjustments in the following way. The producers within the European Union get the energy taxes they have paid refunded if they export the goods. And it's rather easy to determine how much energy has gone into the products and services. And the products and services that come from abroad will be, a toll or a tax will be imposed on that. This will, of course, cause certain problems with the World Trading Organization, legal problems like that. But I think the European Union has fought a big fight with the United States over taxing of bananas. And I think if we have risked that, we should risk the same for the more important goal. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Pierre-René Boukis. Well, first a very short observation and then a short question. The short observation is that the question of weakness of democracy has been discussed by mankind, let's say, in the 4th century BC, in old Greece, you have a whole literature of democracy versus autocracy, the pros and the cons. So all what you said is obvious, but is known for now 2,500 years. The question, on the first slide of our colleague on the gold standard, the last line, you said the spare capacity has increased between 2004 and 2008.
After 2008 it increased.
No, that's not what you said. Can you show your slide? 2004, 2008 spare capacity rising. That's not the data I have at all. So what are your sources?
You're right. This was a misprinting and I was saying it. Between 2004 and 2008, you were always asked about spare capacity and there were huge issues in newspapers about the spare capacity. And that led to that four people, chips could cause a rush of $4 in crude oil. And the spare capacity after 2008 was increasing then, and that's the reason why, in my analysis, that's the reason why we have now a more calm oil market than we had in year 2008.
Well, as far as I know, it has not increased in the recent years, but maybe Olivier Rech has better data than I have. What is your view on the spare capacity?
Yes, I was surprised by this line on the slide, and I would like to mention the fact that in 2009 and beginning of 2010, spare capacity were very temporarily restored, not by suddenly increase of supply, but by collapse of demand. And we are today back in a situation where we are again in a very tight market, exactly like in about 2007 and 2008. So I do not subscribe to this. We would go back to the ancient times of the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000 decade, in which we had structural, important spare capacities. Those spare capacities are condemned to disappear in about, let's say, 2 to 5 years' time.
Great, thanks. Well, we need to close this session now, but before doing so formally and asking Georg to tell us about the breakout sessions, let me thank you for your classical illusion, because it gives me the opportunity to be a peak optimist and remind ourselves that, yes, human behavior performance does lead us to question how quickly we'll respond to things, and there aren't always a clear track record of leadership in this area, but you'll remember, sir, as well, 2,500 years ago, the Greeks beat the largest Persian force ever. Why? Because they converted all of their, in those days, recently discovered silver mines into creating the biggest fleet they'd ever had, working together, and they beat the Persians at Salamis. We need to do that. Thank you very much, and join me in thanking the panel.